Joining me now is the best-selling author of groundbreaking books, including The War on the West, The Strange Death of Europe, and his latest on democracies and death cults. Douglas Murray, let's start with another big win and payout from a media organisation to Donald Trump. Paramount Global has agreed to pay $16 million to settle a legal dispute with the US president regarding a deceptively edited 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris, broadcast on CBS. Let's have a look at an example of this deception. Let's have a look at what Kamala said in The Real Answer and what 60 Minutes put to air.
But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening.
Well, Bill, the work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region.
But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening.
We are not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Just a subtle difference there. The deception was an attempt to tip the scales in favour of the Democratic Party, it was alleged, in the presidential election. It didn't work, Douglas, and it was an expensive exercise.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, you can sort of almost have a little bit of nostalgia, Rita, don't you, for remembering those days when we had to hear Kamala Harris fudging her way through questions as if she was a sort of really, school-age child desperately trying to cover over for the fact that she hadn't done her homework. I mean, it's just excruciating. Hearing her, remembering those wonderful Kamala dialogues, that's why we've done things that needed to be done, which if we hadn't have done the things mightn't have been done in a very real sense for America. I mean, it's just so astonishing that she was ever at the level of candidacy that she was, and indeed in the position that she was as the second most powerful person in the United States. And, this is all just a reminder that despite her obvious inadequacy for the role of vice president, let alone president, there were so many people in the media, let alone the Democratic Party, who were just like wafting her upwards, covering for her, telling us, like with Biden, that she was at the peak performance, the best feat we'd ever had, totally on top of all issues. And yet you see in the unedited tape what we all knew, which was that she was hopelessly out of her depth, as indeed was her boss. But the fact that so much of the media was willing to help her in that really is pretty astonishing. And I think anyone who doesn't think otherwise should just think, what would it be like if we'd found that a media interviewer had covered for Trump in that way, and that he had been floundering, or J.D. Vance had been found totally floundering on a question of geopolitics like this? It's really extraordinary.
And they gave her such softball interviews, and she still floundered. It wasn't like these interviews were hostile, like the ones we've seen Trump and Vance cop. Now let's go to the UK. We've had the orgy of hate at a Glastonbury Music Festival. Pascal Robinson Foster, I've got to say, I'd never heard of him until this week. That's the name of the dude who started the Death to IDF chant and other chants on stage, enthusiastically backed by the crowd. We saw plenty more political statements, all in the one direction. Douglas, how do we begin to understand these young, privileged people at a music festival really having no empathy for people very similar to them who were slaughtered at the Nova Music Festival less than 2 years ago?
It's astonishing, isn't it? The sort of instinct one has on it in a way is, to wish that these morons at Glastonbury ever got a glimpse of what the innocent young people at the Nova Festival saw on the morning of October the 7th. The fact that not much more than a year and a half after the massacre of hundreds of young people at the Nova Festival, another music festival, Glastonbury, would keep on having artists coming out in favor of the people who did the attacks and not on the side of the victims. It's not like it should be a hard one, that. Are you on the side of the big bearded rapists and torturers and murderers and kidnappers? Or are you on the side of the innocent young people dancing in the early hours of the morning at the Nova Festival? These people have decided they're on the side of the rapists and the torturers and the killers and the kidnappers. And it's so despicable. But there's something that needs to be brought out about this, which is there's quite rightly been a lot of rage about this idiot dolt saying death to the IDF, which of course means death to all the young men and women who have mandatory service in Israel and have to risk their lives fighting terrorists up close. But there's been a lot of reaction to that. But there's something else that this moron chanted on stage that's also worth lingering on. I write about this in my Spectator column this coming week, which is he led the crowd in these chants of that you say you want your country back, F that.
Yes.
And all the time with projections on the back of the stage about the fact that immigrants built Britain and much more. This is almost perfectly created to be as divisive and hate-filled a message as possible. He was saying to white British people, you're not going to get your country back. People like me are taking your country. He used terms like gammon, a totally racist term that is used with such ease by these people. And he was just saying, no, actually, we're here. I'm here. You don't have your country anymore. And of course, the amazing irony of him doing this in front of a crowd, merrily waving Palestinian flags. So they pretend to care about indigenous rights, don't care about indigenous Jews, and actually hate indigenous British people, hate white indigenous British people. This is out and out racism against the British public. And I mean, you know, it makes you despair at the fact that all of these people would pay and chant along to hate all the time, thinking they're acting, of course, in the name of love. And the organizers and everyone else should be ashamed of themselves. I very much look forward to the day when we never have to consider Glastonbury again.
I'm so glad you're writing about that. We've talked about that on the program, that entire song and chant, and to hear the crowd sing along enthusiastically, these self-loathing, privileged, almost uniformly white kids. It's almost like a comedy sketch, only it's tragic. Douglas, you wrote a superb piece for the New York Post on the unscientific bullies of the trans movement and how they were allowed to push their often warped ideology with little pushback from the medical fraternity until recently. And one of the most shameful tactics was to terrify parents, to manipulate parents into backing so-called gender-affirming care for their child with lines like, would you rather have a trans daughter or a dead son?
Yeah, I mean, what the column was bouncing off a very interesting piece that, you know, there was this DHSS investigation into this, a scholarly and learned paper by American scientists and others looking into whether so-called gender-affirming care or the giving of cross-sex hormones and the use of double mastectomies on minors, whether this was all such a great idea after all. And the review in question looked at all of the reviews that have been happening, not least the Cass review in the UK, and you know, studies in Scandinavia and all the places you're meant to listen to studies from, showing that all of these countries have understandably been stepping back from the brink of what we were going into in recent years so merrily and unquestioned. And what was striking about it was that the authors of this report in America wanted to remain anonymous, and one of them was outed online. People as trans activist extremists outed this person online, and he wrote to try to sort of justify the findings of the report. But what is striking to me is look at the fact that even in the United States of America in this era, medical professionals and others want to hide their names if they are saying things that are widely accepted now in other countries, such as there is no evidence that giving children cross-sex hormones at an age where they cannot vote, cannot drive a car, cannot buy alcohol, mightn't that be that great an idea, or at least should deserve more questioning? I think it's an example of the fact, we often talk about the terrorizing effects of mobs and so on, but this is how a a sort of fringe part of the trans lobby can actually insinuate its way into the mainstream by trying to terrorize, terrify, and silence actual experts on these questions. It's really shameful, and I'm glad that some people have been finding their voice.
Well, I wish they'd find their voice in this country, because we don't even have a review. We are so backward in this area. We've seen the UK, Scandinavia, the US start looking at the evidence behind this entire dogma, I call it. I mean, this gender affirming care. But in this country, they're too terrified to even review the practices. Now, Douglas, before you go, you've done it now. You've gone and penned a piece about toxic femininity for The Spectator. We've heard plenty about toxic masculinity, but it really isn't. It's almost taboo to be critical of femininity. In fact, we're told the world's problems would probably be solved if we were all just a bit more compassionate and had a bit more empathy and had a bit more feminine traits. Do you disagree?
Yes, I very much disagree. I mean, if you take the view, as it seems our societies have decided to take, that masculinity has toxic traits. Now, this is itself debatable. But if you say there are certain toxic traits in masculinity, things that men should be wary of doing in the public sphere, manners of behavior and so on, it's always presented as if the answer to everything is feminine. But of course, if you do take this line of argument, then it should be recognized that there are certain things pushed as feminine traits in our society, which themselves can be deeply, deeply toxic. And the most interesting one is the one you just mentioned there, is, for instance, the presumption, and whether it's Jacinda Ardern or whether it's Angela Rayner in the UK, there's this Kamala Harris, for that matter. There is this presumption that if we just had more empathy, everything would be better. And they present empathy as a particularly feminine trait, which is itself is sort of wildly sexist. But let's pass over that for a moment. But what's interesting about it is, and I give the example of two things that happened in the UK within a week: the decision to decriminalise abortions after 6 months, which means a child in the womb with a viable chance of surviving outside of the womb can be killed. And this was presented to Parliament as a case of having more empathy for the mothers who find themselves at 8 months wanting to abort their child, and more. And then at the same week, another female Labour MP presented the bill for assisted dying, otherwise known as euthanasia, or choose the date on which you want to die, and the state will help you. This argument, too, was presented solely on terms of empathy, compassion, and understanding. There was almost no analysis or a serious rigor about whether elderly men and women mightn't feel pressured by not being a burden on their families, or not being a burden on the sacred welfare state, and much more. That was all pushed aside, and the bill was voted through, as with the issue of post 6 months abortions, all in the language of empathy, understanding, and much more. But just consider that in these two cases, life in the UK was truncated at both ends in those days by Parliament, and parliamentarians always presenting themselves as filled with compassion. If we are going to live in a society where we want to be alive to toxic traits, we should be alive to them from whichever direction they come from. So I don't doubt that some people will be triggered by that, but reality, as we know, is often triggering.
Reality can be triggering, and I'm expecting just a wave of outrage on X and other social media platforms coming your way. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Great pleasure as always, Rita.